Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Gina Clonan. I'm the founding president of the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. For nearly 3 decades, the Hall has worked to discover and share the stories of women. Our various educational platforms acknowledge the individual and the collective feminine voice. This will be a half-hour, intimate and informative chat, followed by 15 minutes of your questions, which we encourage you to submit at any time during the webinar by simply clicking the Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen. I'll try to get to as many as possible. Our goal is simple, a virtual gathering to talk about today's important issues. We hope this will be a useful source of information while offering up some helpful takeaways. Today's the last day of Women's History Month, and we're delighted to conclude our celebrations in conversation with a woman dedicated to preserving the stories of women around the nation. Her extensive career accomplishments illustrate her unwavering belief in the power of transforming lives through material culture and history. With extensive experience in building museums, she brings a wealth of leadership and knowledge to the National Women's History Museum as it enters an exciting next chapter, a physical presence in DC that complements its long history of virtual programming. Please welcome President and CEO of the National Women's History Museum, Holly Hotchner.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with you today.
Thank you.
Especially on the last day of Women's History Month.
Exactly. Thank you, Holly. Women's history as an academic discipline emerged in the 1970s women's movement, referred to as the second wave. It wasn't until 1987 that Congress officially created Women's History Month. And Holly, it wasn't until 1996, 3 years after the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame was founded, that a National Women's History Museum was conceived. Tell us about that journey from your perspective.
Well, I, of course, have come in only in the last chapter, or the most recent chapter. I think the museum was founded in the way that so many women's organizations, including your own, was founded, I'm sure. A group of very passionate women were outraged that there was not a single representation of a woman in the country's Capitol building, not one. And this is pretty recent history. So it began with a very grassroots movement to discover that, in fact, a sculpture had been made a number of years before of 3 suffragettes, one sculpture, and it had been immediately put into the crypt, very aptly named, which is basically the basement of the Capitol building. So the founder, Karen Stazer, and others lobbied literally to have the sculpture moved upstairs, which you would think would be a very simple idea. But like so many women's issues, it became complex, and every roadblock was thrown in their way, including that the floor might not sustain the weight of this sculpture while it sustained the weight of every other sculpture of a man, including that there was no money to move the sculpture, crazy allegations. And this group raised the money to do an engineering study. They then raised the money to move the sculpture upstairs. And apparently, particularly Congress at that time was even more white male than today. And apparently the comment to be heard was, you know, they're just so damn ugly. And and the retort, allegedly was from one of our women, have you looked at Abe Lincoln lately? Which I thought was really, you know, kind of spot on. But really, the point being that this has been required so much persistence, which is what we always say about most things concerning women's issues of all kinds. And, you know, at this point, the institution is 25 years old and still virtual, and has performed a lot of really important educational functions and so forth, which we can talk about, but the dream of being physical is closer in reach, but still not yet attained.
Yeah, this was probably one of the most fascinating facts I discovered when I was researching this conversations. So just to repeat for our audience, because it does really get to me. So the infamous women's suffragette statue memorializing the pioneering suffragists arrives to the Capitol in 1921, 1 year after the 19th Amendment passes. It then gets buried in the crypt for 76 years. Very symbolic for what's happened for centuries regarding women's contribution to history. Why is the struggle still lagging?
It's a topic that's written about continually, that's researched continually. Certainly in the case of government, I think, and this was a government issue, the lack of women representation made it very difficult to make the case. And in fact, even lobbying for a women's history museum, I mean, there's certainly a change in the number of senators and Congress people who are women, and it doesn't mean that only women would support this, but in fact, historically, it has been women, more likely than men, who have supported women's issues, movements, and so on. I mean, I see this moving of the sculpture upstairs as very aligned to the now very active movement to create more images of women in all the parks and everywhere around the country. And surveys have now been done of how few there are. Even in New York City, I mean, we only had 3 in all 5 boroughs. There's a lot more awareness, which doesn't necessarily translate to dollars to do things about it. And all of these efforts do take funding.
So the National Women's History Museum is credited with raising the awareness that you just talked about for the need for women's history, passing legislation in its favor, and raising money to make the dream a reality. So can you outline for us briefly some of the successes and failures through the last nearly 30 years for all you all?
Well, I think, there was a big move, there still is a very big movement to have a physical presence. A physical presence doesn't necessarily give you the content, and it doesn't necessarily give you who and why you're trying to reach, what people you're trying to reach and how you're trying to reach them. I think serendipitously, the fact that we've been virtual for all these years gives us a huge advantage, actually, in the sense of the millions of people that we do reach. And it is interesting, of our 55,000 members, which is a very large membership, founding members as well, that most of them are not in DC. I mean, it's truly a national group. So the idea, sort of the more traditional museum idea of you build these walls and that is a symbol, and that is what still appeals to many people. The question of how do you really go about educating and inspiring people is a bigger issue for the people who would never go in that box or 4 walls, 5 walls in Washington, DC. How do you really impact communities, and how do you rethink sort of what a museum can be today? So that's what interested me about my script, so to speak, at the point that I came in. People are really interested in local history. They're interested in what's in their backyard. I think the model we all know in terms of teaching history, the model of the textbook, which tells you who the founding fathers mostly are, is being rethought enormously. And we provided a lot of original material so that women's stories could be inserted into teaching lesson plans and so on. And that was a big part of our work over these years, because primary sources cannot be disputed. And so the conversations that come from that can move forward. So
much of what we do in Connecticut is similar to what the National Hall Museum has done. And listening to you, it appears to me, and we see it with museums all over the country, one reason why we never ended up as mortar and bricks, although we had every intention to, was, during the time that museums were seeing a tremendous slump in attendance and yet an incredible increase in the cost of exhibitions. So it appears that today you kind of have to be one of many things. You have to have a physical presence, which can be, as you and I had discussed, which can be something in along the lines of what dance studios, dance companies do, where they take residents up in different places at different
Exactly.
times of the year, to our virtual format, which you and I have both built organizations based on that very successfully, as you say, because we're able to reach so many more people outside of our own physical reach, which is great. And the idea of educational content, which is what really we started out as basically a one-time affair following up a discussion on the women's movement live for 3,000 people in Hartford. We decided to do something local that would concentrate on the achievements of Connecticut women. It was after that it was teachers, and I mean that 100%, who came forward and said, I'd like more. I need more. So we began to be an educational institution for teachers and students because, as you say, they didn't have the textbooks, they didn't have the resources. Original content was built for that community. And I know that yours and our organizations exist for that main purpose still.
Right. I think two comments about that. It is hard when you're relatively small, which we certainly are as a staff, but with a very powerful group of historians as an advisory council, and they are the people that give lectures for us and so forth, which is something we started this year. Lectures bureau kind of idea, but because during Women's History Month, you can imagine we get thousands of requests for personalized programs for corporations and so on and so on. And we found, of course, that we couldn't fulfill all of that. So instead, we started making kits during not just Women's History Month, but Pride Month and many other months of celebration of course, our interest is always in women in that subset, but and we found that it was something to do virtually every day, that you could do things that were more family oriented, or let's say fun thing. Not that education isn't fun, but a variety of activities. And they are extremely well received. They're completely free of charge. And instead of trying to respond to every company saying, oh God, it's Women's History Month, what are we don't have a program, can you do something for us? This is something that we could, quote, roll out. And it's not just for corporations, any individual can use them as well. But we have made a serious commitment over the years to K through 12 learning. And last summer, we started a teacher training institute, which had to be virtual for all the reasons that we know. And it was just fascinating because it was virtual. We had participants from 50 states, which was amazing.
Fantastic.
And the conversation was very powerful and, alarming to me anyway, what teachers are going through today in the classroom, and pushback from parents and others about what subjects they can broach. And so we're all aware of that. So there was really a great interest in discussing that and what kinds of materials and the length and exactly what format would be useful. And a lot came out of it. And certainly there's a lot more to be done. Clearly, we're not a university and we don't aspire to be that, and we don't collect at this point. We do have a small collection, but there's so much material everywhere that's not been seen. Mm-hmm. That we feel committing to collecting, which is costly, very costly, and a long-term commitment at this point isn't necessary. So,
right. It's the same for us. I want to back up for just one moment, because we here in Connecticut would not have experienced such success without our consulting scholars. And you mentioned your historians. Tell us a little bit about their history. And you also mentioned the lecture circuit. Are they doing the lectures in person, or are these virtual feminist historian lectures. Tell us
Well,
about that.
as you can imagine, during COVID, everything became virtual. It's a combination of in-person. Not everyone in the advisory group was available to be a lecturer. We asked everyone, but we got a core group who could either do general topics or speak within their specialties. Everyone has a very specific specialty within this group. So the fee that the institution pays to have a lecturer is redirected to the museum as a way that these people the advisors can contribute to the museum. So it's a model that other kinds of organizations have used, but I felt we needed to sort of formalize the way that we were approaching education. And we did have some amazing generalists who very often did much of our lecturing, but time goes on, some are no longer with us, whatever. So this became, we also have an excellent group of fellows now who are either pre-doc and post-doc, and they, in some cases, have filled that role for us as well.
That's fantastic. Are they all women as well?
Yes, although we'd love to have some men. Oh, we have had some fellows who are men, not at the moment. And we've had interns who are men. I think they got scared away by all of our, not scared away, but I think we were an intimidating group of people.
Yeah, so, around 20 years ago, when certainly we were looking for mortar and bricks, and then you started to look for a concrete museum, a bipartisan congressional committee was created calling for a women's history museum on the Mall. Your museum was said to have contributed $1 million to that commission. Who are some of the players, and bring us up to date on that commission now in 2022?
Sure. Well, the process in DC, which is very much a governmental process, is if you want to be on the Mall of DC or be part of the government, there has to be a congressional study for whether the country wants, in our case, a women's history museum. The previous Latinx now, people had asked for a Latino museum on the Mall as well. They were slightly ahead of us. Now, by the way, there's Asian and Pacific Rim and so on, movement and so on. But anyway, in terms of museums, we were the only, I am told, the only congressional study that wasn't paid for by Congress. I mean, Congress normally funds these studies, and they take about 18 months, and you hire, there's advisors, but you also hire permanent staff to work on them. So we actually funded this because it was a woman's issue, we felt. We were asked to do that. And one of the major funders of that was Meryl Streep, who believed and still believes very strongly in our mission, and a few others. But to raise that money kind of quickly in that sum was a big stretch for us. We hadn't at that time done that kind of fundraising. The commission did, and the commission report used to be on our website. I think it still is, I'm not sure. Did find that, yes, in fact, the nation wanted a women's history museum. So then the process was that it became a bill that we were involved with that went to Congress. It's a lot of political stuff that I won't sideline us onto, but as I understand it, and I am not a politician, but dozens of bills, hundreds of bills of all kinds, not about museums, sit and wait for their day. And in the case of the African American Museum, for example, it took many, many, many years for that to pass. And depending how you date when the movement started, there is a letter in the lobby that's 80 years before that there was a movement to try to have this museum. So it can take a very long time. And very unexpectedly, both the Latino Museum and the Women's History Museum bills were inserted into the COVID relief bill on page 1006. I'm not sure, too many people realized they were in there, but they were. And so the bill passed very unexpectedly a year ago.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Before I talk about that, I just want to back up 1 second to talk about the 30-year journey for the establishment of the museum. It had some pretty compelling behind the scenes evidence rife with discrepancy, political battles, widespread controversy, financial irregularities, and in-house struggles. But it has seemed that this journey has been as divisive as the politics of gender with regard to reproductive rights, fueled by opponents to women's history, conservative critics, and misogynists. So now we come to 2020, and what you just mentioned is the Smithsonian's Women's History Act, approved for a women's history museum and a Latinx museum. But the Smithsonian's Women's History Museum is not the National Women's History Museum. Can you bring our guests up to date on where we stand now and what that looks like?
Sure. It is confusing, definitely. We are the only existing women's history museum. We are not the Smithsonian. The original idea was to lobby for a museum that wasn't necessarily part of the Smithsonian. At least the bill that we were involved with did not designate it as part of the Smithsonian. It then morphed into that for a bunch of political reasons. I think we were trying for really a public-private partnership, and people may or may not know the National Gallery, for example, is not a Smithsonian museum. So there are different models of how museums can happen in DC, which is a very specific cultural environment. So our thought was, and still is, that for however long it takes to get this museum built, the Smithsonian Museum, which could take 10, 15, more than that years, that it would be very important and incumbent upon us to continue to try to present women's history, because every year we are losing contemporary history. We are not, we've delayed so much, 25 years more. The idea was, let's get started. Let's create exhibitions and do more programming and keep the spotlight on women's history. Just
so
because time rolls
I
by.
understand. I'm going to interrupt for a minute because I'm just not sure I understand, or if our guests will understand. Does that mean that your journey, or the museum's journey of nearly 30 years, got kicked out and Smithsonian decided to do their own museum? Or did you in fact say, you know what, we don't want to be part of the Smithsonian group. We want a National Women's History Museum in Washington, but maybe not on the Mall? Or what happened here? Did you agree to this, or did someone kick you out? Or did
I wouldn't call it, I understand. I wouldn't call it kicked out. The bill, which is of course presented by Congress people, became about the Smithsonian when it actually went to Congress. No one asked our opinion particularly about that. Our goal really was to have a museum built. So, there was no discussion about that. It became what the Congress women and senators thought would be most viable.
So will you have a role in that?
Go ahead.
Will the National Women's History Museum that exists now for 27 years, or however long it is, will you have a role in that? Will you coordinate with them? Will they take what you have done and make it part of the Smithsonian?
Well, we are in discussions with the very recently formed Smithsonian Women's History Museum, which I'm not sure what it eventually will be named. I don't think that's been determined. But we are definitely in conversation about what we're doing, what they're planning to do, certainly for the next 5 to 10 years. And I think the ultimate relationship will be figured out as we go along. I mean, this only happened a year ago, and the first 2 years, Congress designated that they needed to hire a director and find a site. So those are the first 2 steps. And we do have 2 of our board members designated in the bill sit on their council. So we are at the table. And I think it remains to be seen. I think there's a lot of goodwill, and we all are there to produce women's programming. I do think it is certainly possible to have more than one institution working on women's history. I think there could be dozens, frankly, and there's so much to be understood, to be found, to be illuminated. You know, I always think there are 2,500 contemporary art museums in this country. Certainly there could be more than one women's history museum.
Without a doubt.
And my goal really was to, or my vision, I guess, was to have a toehold in Washington, which we now have created with this amazing relationship with the Martin Luther King Library, Junior Library.
Can you talk about that? Because that's the first time we've mentioned it for our audience.
Sure. So it is really a brilliant and wonderful public-private partnership. The MLK Library was very controversial when it was named after Martin Luther King Jr. As I understand it, Coretta King came to Washington and asked that it be named for him right after he was killed. And it was controversial in Washington, and they have been very dedicated to activism. It's how they define themselves. And they had just undergone really recently, and because of COVID, have opened at different times, but not in the way they thought, a $220+ million renovation. And it's a fantastic Mies van der Rohe building. If anyone hasn't been there, it's the only Mies building in Washington. There isn't a lot of sort of contemporary architecture in Washington, as we all know. It's an incredible site. It's very large. And the reimagining is just brilliant. Libraries have to rethink themselves now that people aren't taking out books as much as they used to, of course. So it really is a community center with thinking about all of the community of Washington, D.C., all of the wards, all of the people that really use libraries. They've done an incredible job including, I think, the public in a way that museums are lag behind in. Many communities are not intimidated, if you want to use that word, by libraries. This is just my point of view. People are taught that it's a safe space, that their kids can go there and
it's more user-friendly.
Yes, very user-friendly. They're free, which a lot of, DC museums are free, but so many. And, you know, they are a place you can build a community. This is something that museums are very interested in now. So, but we're a little behind in libraries. So I think it's just a brilliant, we can learn from them. We can understand that community. We can think about our shows speaking to the community of DC, which still is, I believe, the highest African-American population of any city in the country, at least.
So when do you take up residence there?
The plan was to open the first show in the first quarter of 2023, but we have already started to program there. So during Women's History Month, we did some physical programs in the library. They have an extraordinary 297-foot seat auditorium that's gorgeous. They have other convening spaces for smaller groups. So we, from now forward, will be doing programming there.
So,
And
Holly, I invited you today because, anyone who wants to read your CV can see you've had tremendous experience in building museums, both structurally and programmatically. So it appears to me that on your watch, you're continuing the legacy of the National Women's History Museum and in ways distinguishing itself from what might become the Smithsonian's Women's History Museum. Whether you're in partners or otherwise, we've got two great things going on in DC. Would you agree?
yes, absolutely. And the Smithsonian has a Women's History Initiative, which is virtual, but it's also providing programming within the Smithsonian museums only about women's history. But that has another initiative that will be happening. And we have done programming and work with some of the Smithsonian institutions. So it's really a win if we can put all of our resources together, have our curators cross-pollinate and so forth. But our idea really was to be, as you explained it, like in residence at the library. So people know there will be always, our programs will always be there. Exhibitions will continue to happen, and hopefully build a community that's interested in dialogue about what's going on with women today.
Well, it appears to me you found that perfect coupling between the physical and the virtual space.
Yes, we were really fortunate that the timing worked out.
Your website states women's history isn't meant to rewrite history. The objective is to promote scholarship and expand our knowledge of American history. At the Hall, we do that through educational programming for women and girls in and out of the classroom. So tell us, you outlined some of the things. Tell us how you will be doing that as you move forward with the Martin Luther King Library.
Well, we have, first of all, we are still experimenting. We try all kinds of programming and see what kind of audience we've begun to really to assess our audience in a more systematic way. So we have Sunday programs, for example, that are just for kids, and various authors reading their children's books, and illustrators working with kids virtually or in person, which we will do in the Children's Library at MLK, which is an extraordinary space. With a slide that goes from the second floor down to the first floor for young learners. It's a great, very wonderful environment. But so anything from that kind of program to talking about approaching topics that might be better for smaller audiences, more intimate audiences, to have conversations about more difficult topics, let's say. The programs that we did during Women's History Month, we started out really wanting to inspire, that's our goal, to inspire boys and girls to think about what women have achieved, and to see concrete examples of women who have excelled in fields that certainly are not commonly thought of, let's say, as well as fields that women are known for achievement. And so we had Indra Nooyi, for example, who everyone probably knows was
she's an inductee in the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. She lives here.
Excellent. Anyway, we had her speak about her journey because, of course, as an immigrant and of course as a woman, but it was a very specific journey. And at the time, she, I believe, was the only woman to run a company the size of PepsiCo. Mm-hmm. And that journey, and maybe some of you have read her memoir that she just wrote, which is so moving. So we tried to start with a very inspiring model and have a conversation with her about basically family, and how that allowed her, the support of her family allowed her in her thinking and in the book to be able to do what she did and
Amazing
does.
Story.
And it's certainly not the model of most American families. And she has been very involved with, maternity leave and other issues that enable women to work that are much more challenging in our country than India, at least from her background. So we started with that kind of inspiration and then more specific conversations about specific topics. But it was meant to be very general audience based and try to reach many different publics.
Well, as I said, conversations are important. That's what finds us here today. I want to remind everyone to get your questions in. We're going to start the question and answer period right now. In closing, Holly, I have to say that I was excited to have this conversation, but at the same time, I'm very saddened that we have to have this conversation after decades of promoting women's history. And you said something that resonated about your collaboration with the Martin Luther King Library. Black history and women's history, it's unfortunate that either one of them would be labeled controversial. But you can see from the legacy of struggle that we've both had to get these stories told, to create physical and virtual spaces around them. It's really quite astonishing and sadly astonishing. And I know you agree, and I'm sure
I totally agree. And I wasn't part of this, but in the past, the misogyny and we were viewed as political left wingers, bra burners, anti-abortion advocates, whatever. Everything was thrown at us, and it was very political.
Well, it still is, and
Yes.
I always tell this story, and I credit the woman who one of our co-founders and one of our consulting scholars, Dr. Jane Barstow. Once she was asked by a man if why wouldn't we have a Connecticut Man's Hall of Fame? And she said, for the same reason we don't have a White History Month. And that tiny statement speaks volumes.
Yeah, the fight for Women's History Month was also undertaken by one of our board people primarily, and that was a very long struggle as well.
Exactly. So I'm looking at one of the questions today. Have either of you considered working in tandem with national or local brick and mortar museums in order to have a presence and to emphasize the contribution of women in science, art, and politics?
Well, in fact, that's exactly what we're doing. We're working with a library that has exhibit space to as a place to tell our stories. It has 2 million people a year that come in the door. It's a fantastic partner. Other partners could certainly be museums, could be historical societies, could be other kinds of sites that have the audience and the space and the interest. So the second part of our plan was to take, we are starting with African-American women and their impact on DC, partly because of our partnership with the library, but also we are DC. And to take that in a national way, not as a traveling show necessarily, but to go to different communities and help them uncover the people, women, African-American women who have impacted their communities, and to take that kind of on the road and be in residence at different kinds of buildings. So
I love that idea.
Yes, that's exactly what we are trying to do.
Uncovering and promoting the stories of women to educate and inspire women and girls, men and boys to be all that they can be. I should like to say too, to the person who asked the questions about collaboration with museums, nonprofits, and some museums are for profit, some are not, but particularly in the realm of nonprofits, which we are, we've struggled and we continue to struggle. The pandemic has made our struggle even worse. Holly mentioned earlier, most of these efforts are oftentimes run by women and a few women. So we're stretched to the max in terms of our human power to do all the things we dream of doing. And I have found, certainly in our history here in this state, it's not easy to raise money for women's history. As you just saw, when we've talked about some of the controversies, we still have to fight, and we do not have an endowment, and we do not have a huge fund behind us. Every year we start out from square one, raising money for that budget. And Holly, you know this better than anyone who has worked so long in this field.
Yeah, our institution is in a similar situation. We certainly don't have an endowment. We do have certain recurring income at this point, but it does not cover the entire operating budget. So it is a continual, struggle, if you want to use that word, or opportunity, depending how you look at it.
Exactly.
But most non-governmental libraries and museums were founded by women and men who made a large contribution to get them started.
Grassroots,
it is the history of performing arts. It's the history of so many things. Non-municipal institutions are generally founded, not necessarily by robber barons like Morgan and others, but also just to cite the Women in the Arts Museum in DC, that was founded by a woman Billie Holiday, and she funded the whole thing. And this is a model for so many institutions in everywhere. Carnegie, okay, that's another robber baron, but I shouldn't call him a robber baron, but you know what I mean. But there are certainly women who have stepped forward to finance organizations and institutions that they believe in.
We continue to do so. Here's another question. American University did a 3D printer statue exhibit of women on the mall for Women's History Month. Do you know what is happening with these statues?
If you're talking about the show that's up right now in the Smithsonian building that's called the Castle, that was actually funded by a visionary woman from Texas, the whole project. It's not American University, but these sculptures are amazing. And the goal at the moment is that they will travel around the country to different cities. They are absolutely spectacular. They're life-size and very colorful, and all kinds of people, women from every walk of life, both historic, contemporary, lots of contemporary people. So it's a fantastic statement / engaging way to get people's attention about women who have been so important. But it was due to the great vision and philanthropy of one woman.
I love it. So maybe we could replace the cows.
Yes, exactly. The cow parade. We have
women in every downtown.
It's moved on from the cow parade, but these are really quite fantastic, and they're very, very wonderful representations of each woman. And when it opened, some of the women stood with the sculptures, and it was great. It was great. Well, just opened. So if that's what you're referring to, I don't know about American University, but I think that must be what you're referring to.
Well, that's great, Holly. And I love always ending on a positive note. So in closing, I'd like to say today is the last day of Women's History Month. Won't you consider a gift to Connecticut's premier Women's History Vault by donating at cwhf.org. I'd like to thank the Avangrid Foundation in partnership with CNG, SCG, and UI for supporting this series. Today's presentation, like all our webinars, will be uploaded to our website, cwhf.org, within a day or two as part of our educational programming platform. Once again, many thanks to you, Holly, for this important and illuminating chat in honor of Women's History Month.
Thank you for having me. And I am living in Connecticut also, so it's wonderful to see what's happening in this state.
I forgot to mention that, but we're glad you're in the neighborhood. And I hope you'll all join us next month for a special presentation. Look out for that announcement soon. So everybody, thank you for joining us. Have a great day. We're finishing right on time. That's our goal. And we'll see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you, and keep up the great work.
Thank you, Holly. And we're going to get together, right?
Yes, we are.
We like to make friends with these conversations, everybody. Have a good one.
Way to do it.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.